Welcome to another episode of Latin America Review. Thanks everyone for joining us. We have taken a little bit of a break. We haven't had too many new episodes lately because we've been focusing on other projects, but we're actually celebrating Calcecha News' anniversary. This week, we're 3 months or 3 years old. We're turning 3 this year, and we'd like to thank everyone for all the support we've received by way of subscriptions to our Patreon. And it's been really helpful and really crucial in allowing us to carry forth this sort of work and not have to rely on the other jobs we do in order to try to keep things afloat. If you're not subscribed to our YouTube, this is, of course, going to be up on our YouTube. And we are really close to a really key number of subscribers on YouTube. And so please subscribe and turn on your notifications. We haven't really encouraged people to do that, but we really want to grow our YouTube channel and get some new viewers. Today we're discussing a topic that normally Ollie covers for us, which is Chile. Joining us from the UK is Francisco Dominguez. He is the former head of the research group on Latin America at Middlesex University in London, and he's also a Latin American activist from Chile, and he does a lot of great work covering a lot of different countries of Latin America. That's why it's so interesting to speak to him. But today, of course, we're speaking about Chile. So thank you so much for being with us, Francisco.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting us.
Okay, so we covered the last time I think we spoke to you. Well, we talked about a couple of things, but it was after a referendum had taken place. So tell us right now what it is that Chile just voted on Sunday.
Yeah, on the merits, or because of the rejection of the previous constitutional text proposed for a referendum that was rejected quite substantially by about 62% of the electorate that voted, then the political authorities were mandated to have another referendum. And the reason is the referendum that mandated to produce a new text, to have a new constitution, is still valid. So therefore, that was the reason for having this one. Rather than having had a similar constitutional convention as before, which was, various social organizations, social movements, political organizations, indigenous people, and so on, elected, organized in all sorts of social organizations around the country, elected the majority of those in the convention at the time. This time round, President Gabriel Boric decided that instead of going for that sort of mandate, that is to say, a really popular-based mandate, he decided to make some compromises with Parliament, which is controlled by the right wing. And the consequence was a new convention, and the convention is going to produce a new text, and this convention was elected on the basis of 50 representatives only. And the result was extremely negative for the change. The extreme right wing got a huge majority. Out of the 50, I don't know how you call them in English, the convention members, out of the 50, the Republican Party, which is the extreme right wing, led by a guy who I would call a fascist or a Nazi, José Antonio Caz, got 23. And the party that was organized around the traditional right wing, which ran the country with Piñera, Renovación Nacional, the Unión Democrática Independiente, which was the old Pinochetista right wing, they got 11. So you have 23 plus 11, which is 34. And then the left, which is a very broad left, called Unidad para Chile, Unity for Chile, got only 16. That is to say, this very right-wing majority now have been empowered by this referendum to actually determine which is going to be the new constitutional text that is supposed to replace the one constitution that Pinochet negated us. So very, very bad.
Yeah, that doesn't sound great. So what have they said that their intentions are, this far right of 34 representatives that are supposed to be drafting the text? What have they said they're going to do?
Well, I think they're going. I don't know. I think they're discussing what they're going to do because it's been a surprise for them as well. I think they knew they were going to do well, but I don't think they knew they were going to do so well. So now that the extreme right wing is in the saddle, they're going to dictate the terms of what they want in the future, in the new constitution. I think it's very likely. This is just a guess on my part, on the basis of what I know. I think what they're likely to do is they cannot maintain the old constitution because that will politically very silly. Although that's one option, but I don't think they will go for that because the old constitution by Pinochet was underwent several reforms over the years and stopped being as Pinochetista as at the beginning, if you see what I mean. So these people who are extremists are unlikely to, be happy with that. So what they're likely to do is to produce a new text, which is going to be very neoliberal, hard neoliberal in the old Pinochetista sense, without the worst aspects of the dictatorship, but with additional dimensions which are social, such as question of gays, the question of immigrants, the question of racism, the question of the indigenous population. I think on that one they're going to take a very, very strong line. And it's very likely that they're going to produce a constitution which is going to be extremely unsavory, to put it mildly. Not that I think like them, but if I were them, that's what I would do, if you see what I mean.
Well, I do see what you mean. So I guess the big question for a lot of people has been why with the outcome? You said they were surprised. A lot of people were surprised by how grave this outcome was, how well this sector of the far right performed in this vote. So why did that happen? Is it due to the unpopularity of the sitting president? What's going on? Why are people so unhappy if that's the case?
Yeah, I'm going to give you a longish answer if that's
Great.
okay, because we need some background. To start with, I think the blame is squarely on Gabriel Boric's shoulders. Absolutely no question about that. And the reason why I'm saying this is because I imagine if Salvador Allende had been in charge, he would have taken responsibility for it, and he would have campaigned vigorously from day one in order to focus totally and absolutely on ensuring that the original text that was actually the original text of the Constitutional Convention that was defeated before this election, should have been approved. Instead, Gabriel Boric did exactly the opposite. He did not campaign, and his coalition campaigned very weakly and erratically at best during the period when the new text was actually released for voting and the campaign period to campaign for it or against it until it was voted on. And as a consequence, he left, and his leadership left a vacuum to the right wing, which the right wing used to the full. I mean, let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean by this. In the intervening period between the issuing of the new constitutional text for voting, the one that was defeated, and the actual referendum, Boric organized a public discussion conversation with Zelensky. Whatever you may think about the Ukraine, people can have any view they want. Why on earth? I wanted to use a stronger expression, but how you understand. Why on earth will the main leader, which is identified with the new text, will organize a discussion in that period by bringing that issue in, confusing just about everybody. What exactly are you up to? That was my question at the time. So that was one. Secondly, he used this period to make several statements, partly against Cuba, certainly against Venezuela, but also against Nicaragua, trying to place himself, as it were, in a very, I would say, pretentious manner, that he was better than all the traditional left because he was above these bias regarding human rights and so forth. And he said he was prepared to condemn them no matter who actually perpetrated them. In other words, taking a middle attitude. And this was actually capitalized massively by the Chilean media. Um, if one were to compare the control of the control that the right wing actually exerts of the media in Chile with, say, Venezuela, this would be the comparison. Whereas in Venezuela, the government controls about 15-20%, and the right wing controls about 75-80%. In Chile, the right wing controls about 150% of the media. So they use this, massively capitalize on this by blaming, doing propaganda about Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and so on, all this. So all this period was massively wasted by the president, and there was very little campaigning on his part. I remember writing an article before the election, saying before that referendum, saying that although what was going on in Chile was very exciting, one of the weakest points of Chile was the lack of leadership. We did not have even a conglomeration, a united front, anything that resembled political leadership. And it was totally clear that when it came to the crunch, somebody like Gabriel Boric will not take responsibility, will not campaign, and the consequence was this was capitalized by the right, and therefore they rejected the first text, which was extremely good. I mean, if anybody were to examine that text, that dealt a lethal blow to most of the aspects of neoliberalism in Chile. It was really fantastic. Deprivatization of water, universal health care and education free of charge, special rights for the indigenous people, and so on and so forth. So it was really, really good. The abolition of the private pension system, I can go on. It was very, very good indeed. It wasn't perfect, but it was definitely the best thing we ever had. So that was defeated as a consequence of this misleadership. And between the moment when Boric made a compromise with the right wing in Congress and this new convention, the one that just been voted on, actually took place, the right wing, this is my perception, I think many people will agree with me, the right wing organized a huge national campaign of terror. That is to say, they created the conditions for people believing that crime was so dominant in Chile. The media was literally every second of the day bombarding people with crimes, assaults, criminality, and so on. I watched television myself at the time, and I remember there were 3 or 4, for example, assaults, which are normal in Latin America. Not that it's a good thing, but they're normal, and they will repeat them again and again and again and again. And this crime wave was associated very heavily in the mind of people, but I think it was also true, with immigrants from Venezuela and Colombia. And the immigrants from Venezuela particularly, but also from Colombia, were invited to Chile by Mr. Sebastián Piñera, which was part and parcel of the program of destabilization and delegitimization of the Maduro government that, Mr. Sebastián Piñera was part of. So all this period was all this campaign against migration, or about migration, against migrants with very strong racist undertones, but also these, terror campaign that population was feeling really insecure, and security was the crucial question. But the worst part of it was that the Boric leadership did not do anything to counteract. Very little. I mean, the right wing therefore had a vacuum totally for themselves, and they used it fully. The consequence is this. And I think it looks, if there is any logic in politics, and there is always logic in politics, if this continues as it is, which I think it's going to be, not only we're going to have a much more negative constitution than the one that Pinochet represented, even though within the overall umbrella of Chilean democracy with all these limitations, but then that will create a context for the extreme right wing to elect the coming president in 2026.
Okay, all very important things. I maybe will ask you about what the prospects are for the future. But going back to what you said about associating crime, sort of this like implicit association, or what people are going to naturally associating because of what they see in the media, and because of the, this constant right-wing campaign of news that we see all across Latin America, specifically in South America, about the situation in Venezuela and these different things. Of course, that's going to be the association people are making sitting at home, unfortunately. And this was kind of a little bit of a scandal online as well, because I don't know what was the reason Boric was standing at the podium, but he was giving some remarks to the press, and he had said, had mentioned this Vuelta a la Patria flight that returned to Caracas on board over 100 Venezuelans who are, of course, being repatriated. These are people who have for long been asking, pleading with the embassy or with the diplomats there in Santiago to get them back to Venezuela. Like many people around the continent, even probably in Spain as well, and other places, have been asking for these repatriation flights from the Venezuelan government. And they just want to go back. They know the situation has in many ways improved. Things are recovering. And they know that, some of their family members and friends are actually thriving back in Venezuela. Things are very difficult still. None of the sanctions have really been lifted. And people are having to, still rely on making income in dollar and euro, let's say. But they have a lot of reasons to want to go back. And it seems as if Boric at this press conference was kind of attributing this success of this flight, of which there have now been, I think, like hundreds of flights or flights and buses repatriating Venezuelans. He was kind of taking credit for it himself, for having brokered it, when really the Bolivarian government has been really busy trying to get its citizens home from Ecuador, from Peru, from Colombia, just nonstop for like at least the last 3 years, as part of this initiative that was, of course, introduced by President Nicolas Maduro himself. And it seems like Boric was taking credit for its success, but it's happening all the time. And the other thing I want to say was, like you said, Sebastian Piñera was there at that Cucuta concert when Juan Guaido was smuggled into Colombia through the Venezuelan-Colombian border after relations had collapsed between Venezuela and Colombia. And Guaido was actually smuggled in by paramilitaries to go attend this Venezuela Aid Live concert that was organized by Richard Branson. And, all of these reggaeton artists and people decided to go support it, some of which actually performed there. And all this money was raised, and it was this big corruption scandal where it was used literally to pay for prostitution, drugs, and hotels. But anyways, Sebastian Pineda was actually there hugging, taking pictures and selfies with Guaido, with Mario Abdo Benitez, and everyone else you saw there, including just tons of U.S. officials. But that's to say that when this current government was elected in Chile, this government didn't do anything to actually reverse the collapse of relations between Chile and Venezuela, as most other governments have done in the region. In fact, for example, Lula quickly reestablished those ties with Venezuela,
Petro in Colombia,
Petro, every country, including in the Caribbean, St. Lucia.
Paraguay.
And Paraguay is set to do that. I don't know what they have done in the initial steps because it's only been 2 weeks, or less than 2 weeks, 1 week. But this is a right-wing president-elect who said he's going to, from the governing party, the conservatives, and he is going to reestablish relations with. And so it really speaks to what this supposed progressive, a lot of people have called it left-wing government, Chile, stands for.
I think, the right wing always uses the question of migration, racism, misogyny, the worst possible things. We know this. Certainly crime is always manipulated. It's very manipulative, and the media are expert on this. So we who have been subjected in Chile to this, and Boric knows this very well, he should know better in the sense that when there is such a campaign organized, the purpose is not to highlight crime. The purpose is political. And the political purpose in this case was to ensure that people voted in the way they wanted by being induced in this direction. So therefore, any left-wing government in the world, any left-wing political organization in Latin America, certainly, will actually counteract it. And we have plenty of arguments. I mean, we have millions of arguments. We've been through these for decades. And certainly in places such as Chile, it should be much easier, let alone take initiatives to come, to actually deal with the problem, which is sometimes problematical when you don't have a majority in parliament. But in terms of the propaganda itself, it is totally possible to actually counteract it very easily. Look at the example of Venezuela, which you mentioned. Venezuela defended itself extremely well by saying we have 6 million Colombians emigres in this country, and they enjoy every full right as everybody else does. When it comes to the question of racism, Venezuela is able to demonstrate how they deal with racism, how they integrate and give special rights and, promote, highlight the whole question of racism, educate society, and so on and so forth. In this case, he capitulated to the narrative of the right wing and tried to accommodate in his own understanding. It is totally pathetic, in my view, to try to salvage some of the disaster by pretending that you were responsible for brokering this agreement where some, Venezuelans actually went back, which is going to mean politically, in a scale 1 to 10, minus 25, to be honest with you. So therefore, it seems to me, it's a total failure of political leadership. And he has it completely on his shoulder because he was the president and he was elected by the people. People actually fought, died in order to get these conditions, to change the constitution, to get rid of Pinochet, to get rid of Pinochetismo, to get rid of neoliberalism, and he was the result. It wasn't the result that many of us prefer, but definitely he was the result. So therefore, he was responsible, accountable to ensure that he delivered what, broadly speaking, the masses wanted. And what he did, he failed miserably. And now he's trying to mend fences, pretending that he's not responsible, covering his own, the rear, as it were, which is not going to do any good to the cause, which is what matters. In fact, it's going to make things much worse. So let's see what happens from now on.
Yeah, and so one of the criticisms I've had that I have been fairly vocal about is that Boric himself, as well as Gustavo Petro, have kind of positioned themselves as some sort of leader in human rights without really talking about oftentimes what human rights even means. And to me, and I think for a lot of people around Latin America, human rights means things like improving material conditions. Certainly for people in Bolivia and people in Venezuela, it means millions of homes built and given to people at a very low cost, as under the Bolivarian Revolution. This, massive housing program, the houses being built in Nicaragua, and these sorts of things that have really served to just instantly and immediately improve the living conditions of people who still in these countries earn very low salaries, and things are going to be very difficult for those reasons, but they're still making gains in lots of other areas, which includes economically. That to me is human rights. Much can be said about the examples we see in Nicaragua and other countries. But so he has been speaking very vaguely, very abstractly about human rights and championing them, but he's championing them largely, at least from what I can see, on the exterior. So not only is it completely vague and we don't really know what it means, his idea, it really just sounds like a copy of what is said from the State Department and from different agencies and NGOs that project around the world some sort of message about human rights and democracy, but it's also that he's not even talking about it in the context of his own country. So, I mean, what do you think of this? Do you think he's ever going to like change this particular strategy that he has? Because as far as I'm concerned, if I was Chilean, I would be very concerned with what my president and government was doing for me, and not so concerned about what he's doing going abroad in terms of campaigning for the human rights of other countries.
Sure, the discussion of human rights is an important one, and the position that governments and presidents and leaders take, matter. And sometimes they have to actually take strong positions and be abstract about it. And that may be construed, and it is construed by some of the media and some interested parties to say, that's what he meant. And they identify specific governments that the media want to target. But when it comes to the functionality, the political functionality of what you mean by human rights, we can see that Petro actually articulated immediately, close collaboration with the Venezuelan government to ensure that there was peace in Colombia. The peace process actually could be guaranteed. He reinitiated it, and then he went for every possible area of collaboration with Venezuela, even though during the electoral campaign he made some very critical pronouncements. When it comes to Boric,
so it was a pleasant surprise in terms of what Petro did in the campaign period and what he's doing right now with Venezuela, mending relations and in all these different areas has been very positive. So in the case of Boric, go ahead.
Well, sometimes my understanding is sometimes, people who want to be elected president, they have to make these pronouncements. Possibly, I don't want to blame them of anything, possibly because they want the discussion of the electoral campaign not to be focused on, say, in the case of Petro, on Venezuela. He wanted to discuss Colombia, and the media wanted to discuss Venezuela. So therefore, he made the pronouncement, the media left him alone, he concentrated on Colombia, he won the election, and then immediately moved to the right position, which is perfect. In this case, Boric was already elected, number one. He was the president, enjoyed a very interesting position. He came on the wave of social rebellion. So he had the relation of forces on his side. He did not have to equivocate. He did not have to actually make any compromise of any kind whatsoever. And rather than doing that, rather than focusing on what the masses and the movement and the politics of the situation demanded, he actually started to equivocate on the question of human rights, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. And he was extremely selective. For example, not once he mentioned Guatemala. Not once. Not once he mentioned many other places where, there is a very level of gross violation of human rights. He was totally selective, and he was politically selective. And the reason why he did that was because he wanted to somehow congratulate himself with the right wing to say, I'm like you, I'm not like the all left. I'm like you, I'm quite prepared to criticize this government, and I'm going to concentrate on this, forgetting completely what the real thing is. In my view, to sort of draw some preliminary conclusions about his politics, I think he leans to the right, much more than he leans to the left. And at the end of the day, when it comes to the crunch of the massa, and you are untested by events, then you come up with a real position because you are under duress. And in this case, this is what he's done. I don't want to yet draw the conclusion that he may have done all of this deliberately to derail the constitutional process into what it is. I leave that possibility open. But in terms of political performance, of somebody who has been put in a position of political responsibility to actually carry out what broadly the masses wanted, he has completely failed, and he has failed because of these equivocations. He should have concentrated on Chilean matters. There was no reason not to. He should have concentrated on the constitutional process. Instead, he allowed his foreign minister, for example, Antonio Rejola, to go to Spain during the campaign for the referendum. He allowed her to go to Spain to meet the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Spain, and then issued a public statement, a joint statement demanding advance presidential elections in Venezuela when nobody in the world, not even Biden, was actually demanding it. It's only Boric. And you cannot imagine the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Antonio Rejola, making such a statement without Boric, accepting it and agreeing to it. So clearly it was his policy. And I have no idea what he was who was trying to impress with that. He was not going to impress the right wing. The right wing knows him already. They don't like him. He was trying to impress who? The right wing in the United States. They know him already. And, when it comes to discarding people, the United States are masters of that. So the consequence of all of that stupidity, political blindness and political stupidity and political bias, is that the people of Chile actually now have to contend with a very strengthened extreme right wing who are going to wreak havoc in the economy, society, and politics.
Right. Well, one question that I think a lot of people have asked me, for example, and I'm not someone people should be asking about Chile, is what the position has been of the different members of that coalition of parties and forces that brought him to power, specifically the Communist Party of Chile. What are those people saying now? Are they continuing to support him or make sort of excuses or try to justify some of the things he's doing because of the tremendous pressure he's under? Or have some people begun to sort of splinter off and become hard critics?
We have to wait and see for these developments. I think it would be too premature to draw too many conclusions. My sense is that the Communist Party of Chile is the Communist Party of people who wanted to remain communist after the collapse of the USSR. When the USSR and the Soviet bloc collapsed, many communists joined the wrong side, almost, in huge quantities, not only in Chile, but elsewhere. The people who remained communist in Chile, as well as in many other places, not in all places, but in many other places, were people who wanted to remain on the left and wanted to remain communist as they understood it. And in the case of the Chilean Communist Party, they began quickly after that to identify with the new left that was emerging in Latin America. So they identify with Lula, they identify with Chavez, they identify, with all of the new emerging during the first pink tide. So it was very interesting to read what they were saying about it. When it came to Chile, they made sort of compromise because they were very small and were a very small minority party. My sense is that they thought the Boric government would create opportunities for them to move forward the social progressive agenda, that they have in mind. If you read their program, it's pretty good. Now we'll see what happens now. Obviously, this is going to lead the party into an internal discussion. There are very good people. There are some people who are not that strong, and we'll see how that pans out. I doubt that the party is going to split, and I doubt that the party is going to do the wrong thing. I suppose what they're likely to do in this period is to try to salvage as much as possible of whatever was left of the social explosion and the previous period, and then push forward with that. You have the Socialist Party, which is pathetically terrible. Christian Democracy got zero members elected, zero. And there was a party called the Party of the People, Partido de la Gente, that also got zero, a sort of center-right, center-left, but very peculiar. The Communist Party, on the other hand, is the one party that has a sort of overall political view. The other party, Convergencia Social, which is the political party of Boric, doesn't have that. They have a sort of set of abstractions about, how society should behave. Because I've listened to him, I listened to Giorgio Jackson, who is the key, I would call, intellectual, and honestly, it's so abstract what they say that it's difficult to understand. And in the final analysis, it seems to me that people like Giorgio Jackson and people like Boric are liberal, in the political sense, who will lean towards the wrong side when the class struggle actually takes a downturn. But the Communist Party has an overall view, whereas the Socialist Party, just to finish the spectrum there, the Socialist Party was, ever since 1990, committed to perfecting neoliberalism, which they did with alacrity. So very little is going to come out of that, except from the rank and file. I think if the Communist Party is going to get anywhere, we'll have to make some electoral alliances with that base, because that really matters. Even sections of the base of the Christian democracy who radicalized over the last period. If that happens, then there is a possibility. But crucially, and it's not me who's going to give advice to people of what to do, because it would be pretentious and certainly arrogant. But in terms of taking examples from Latin America, look what happens in Honduras. Various social organizations came together. They first called themselves National Popular Resistance Front, and then they became a political party called Libre, and then they won the election, and they elected Xiomara. But there was a political leadership, and that, it seems to me, is one of the key lessons that perhaps the Chileans would like to take on board and see how, in the Chilean circumstances, which are very different from the ones in Honduras, how can they put together some sort of collegiate leadership that actually can, at this stage, not necessarily move things forward, but certainly resist what is going to come, which is going to be very nasty.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention, with regards to human rights, perhaps connected to that, was that quite recently, perhaps a month ago, there was some sort of a conference that took place in Santiago where some sort of collection of different leftist and progressive parties met, and it was a meeting that was like held over a weekend, largely hosted by the party of Gabriel Boric. It was also included some people like Alvaro Linera from Bolivia, and who was the former vice president, but others who consider themselves to be progressive, including the PSOL from Brazil. And they are sort of purporting to attempt to create some other sort of collection of parties, let's say some sort of block of leftist parties of the region, as an alternative to the Sao Paulo Forum. And this is really interesting because the language that they use is largely saying that we need a new block, new articulation for new times, the new issues, and saying that these other parties that are all part of the Sao Paulo Forum are no longer relevant. They don't speak to the issues of our time, and that sort of a language, which for me is extremely offensive and insulting, to say the least, because these are the most important political parties right now. Some countries that participate in the Sao Paulo Forum, it's like 6 parties, and a range of them, they're not all my party, for example, but extremely relevant, with very important positions being taken, and all respectively trying to make change within their countries, either from the government in some cases, such as the Sandinistas, or in other cases, as a party that might only have a few seats in the national parliament, let's say. So I think it's a very interesting thing, because not only is he going, Boric, making these sorts of statements about human rights, but it seems that in one way or another, the sort of resources of the state have been used to create a new platform for this supposed human rights, and the way in which it's going to take form with these alliances with other parties throughout the region. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to prosper.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a dead end. And the reason why I'm saying this is because the crucial political forces actually are transforming Latin America. They transformed before, they are transforming it now, despite the setbacks since 2016, when Dilma Rousseff was, well, since Nelson Zelaya was actually overthrown in 2009, but certainly more crucially, since Dilma Rousseff was impeached in 2016, the United States was able to recover a great deal of the terrain, leaving very few left-wing governments pretty isolated and under pressure. And we recovered the terrain quite dramatically now with the addition of Colombia and the addition of Mexico. All of them with complexities. Nothing is perfect in politics. So these are the crucial organizations. These are the crucial political parties. These are the crucial leadership. The idea that you're going to try to set up something which is in between the real left, which actually made the difference to millions and millions and millions and millions. And this is no exaggeration. This is literally millions and millions and billions of people who benefited from the policies of these lefts. I'm talking about the Sao Paulo Forum left. And then try to establish something between them and the real right. It's just completely silly. It's not going to prosper because there are no enough social forces in Latin America, certainly in Chile, to actually be able to produce this. This election demonstrates that when you equivocate in that fashion, you leave the terrain open for the enemy to take control completely. The sad thing seems to me is that the Forum de Sao Paulo Forum, did not have sufficient influence in the Chilean left to actually be able to push it in the right direction. The very idea that Boric, with some forces which behave erratically sometimes. I don't want to mention any of them, but you mentioned a few. Sometimes they behave very erratically. You never know exactly what they're up to. There is an element of opportunism, because when the real mass party is in trouble, then some of these organizations think this is the moment to actually try to get, the masses behind you, trying to get score some significant points, which never works. Let me give you a couple of examples. The Workers' Party in Brazil has 3 million members. It was established in 1979. It's got huge experience. It's run the government several times, from 2002 all the way to 2016. And then now it's running the government again. And in the last election, the Workers' Party got 60 million votes. And if you add to that, the PSUV from Venezuela, and then you have the FSLN, then you have the Petro Pacto Histórico, then you have Ad Morena. I mean, these are gigantic organizations, and not only they are gigantic organizations from the electoral point of view, they are gigantic organizations from the point of view of social movement that are behind them, and they do make a massive difference. They nationalize things. They, combat neoliberalism in real terms. They grant rights to people that never had them, in all sorts of ways. And they are collaborating together to build the new world collectively. And this is what is coming. So Chile is isolated itself, now with this election. So I don't think it's going to prosper. In fact, were there to be similar initiatives in the future, people like me will start, criticizing them for splitting the real forces of change, progressive change in Latin America.
Yeah, well, you've said a lot of interesting things there. And I would love to continue this conversation, but I think because you're such a good speaker and analyzing, you know, on a larger scale, I have to ask you, what do you think? You did mention that some of Chile or Boric's administration spent some time dealing with the Ukraine issue and fiddling with hanging out with their friend Zelensky there. What do you think of Latin America and Lula's role with regards to trying to negotiate peace with, alongside China and their proposal between Russia and NATO, or Ukraine?
Yeah.
Um, what's your take on that? I mean, you're there in the UK. Obviously, people are seeing things very differently there from how they see it in Latin America. But and also, what do you think is sort of the potential for Lula and his administration's leadership capacity from our region? I think it's just massive. It's like unbelievable. This weekend, he made those comments about Assange. And this is a position he's had now for 13 years, as far as I've been able to track. He categorically denounced the political imprisonment of Assange in 2010. And he has made similar declarations. But the fact is that other governments have as well. Nicolas Maduro, obviously Daniel Ortega, Petro now, and both Evo and Lucho, and nobody cares, to be quite honest. We could cut that soundbite and it wouldn't go viral, and maybe a few people would love it. Maybe some of Assange's legal team might share it somewhere. But the fact is when Lula said it, it was this big thing. So talk to us a little bit about what you see as being Brazil's role and Lula's role in the world right now, and
Yeah.
the potential for peace negotiations that could have something to do, some involvement from our region.
Well, it's really massive because it's a manifestation of the new geopolitics emerging in the world, the multipolarity. And my sense is, and I'm going to cut a very long argument quite short, my sense the United States is waging war because it doesn't want multipolarity. It's war against multipolarity. That's the real war. That's the reason for it. Whatever the specifics in the Ukraine and so on, we can discuss that, but that's the reason for it. And the United States is declining severely. I don't have time to give you all the figures because it will take 3 days, but I know them all. But it's very bad. It's extremely bad. I mean, it's worryingly bad. And as a consequence, the United States is losing its positions everywhere in the world, certainly with the rise of Asia, particularly China, which is making alliances internationally with Africa, with Asia, with Latin America. That's where Brazil comes in. And we now have a privileged interlocutor in Lula, in Brazil, which is part of the BRICS and is part of the emerging alliances elsewhere, which are alliances, in my view, for the good because they operate on the concept of the win-win idea, which is China's idea of win-win. In fact, I thought this was Chinese myself, but actually it's English. It's both sides, when they enter into agreement, both sides win. Not only that, we have Dilma Rousseff, who is actually the president of the New Development Bank, which is the bank of the BRICS. It's got a working capital of $200 billion, with the possibility of emerging infrastructures, of developing infrastructure everywhere. So the very fact that Lula is setting up some sort of international group of countries to actually broker some peace negotiation is something the United States is desperate to stop, and it cannot, because the weakness the United States has is the Atlantic relationship is being fragmented as a consequence of the policy of the United States damaging Europe very badly, extremely badly. The UK is an appendix, a military appendix, and a political appendix of the United States since 1944. So therefore, don't expect anything interesting or anything different or any autonomy emerging from this government and possibly the next one. Nevertheless, in Europe, you have a serious process of fragmentation where they know that what is being done to them as a consequence of this wars waged by the United States against multipolarity is really destroying the economy of Europe, and Europe cannot sustain it any longer. And the United States not only is actually intensifying the war against in the Ukraine, but it's also busily preparing the possible war against China using Taiwan as the proxy and as the excuse. So the very fact that Lula, sort of representing Latin America, having that weighty voice in these circles, in these, I don't know, summits and bodies, this is extraordinarily important, not only because it can save lives, in the immediate sense by stopping the war and getting a truce, but also because these possible peace will guarantee that multipolarity will continue to develop. And additional to this is the very fact that Lula, in his statements, in one of the statements recently, in the meeting of the BRICS, he said that one of the key things that Latin America has to do was to fight against the supremacy of the dollar, which is absolutely correct politically. And he made an agreement with um, Alberto Fernandez in Argentina to set up a single currency, a common currency rather, not a single currency, but a common currency. Now, this, to establish this sort of thing is not easy. Nevertheless, this is part and parcel of the worldwide process of de-dollarization that is taking place in the world. Saudi Arabia decided to sell its oil output to China and be paid in yuan, not in dollars anymore. And Saudi Arabia exports 27% of its oil output to China. And you know how much does it export to the United States? Only 8%. So this is massive. And Saudi Arabia now has asked to actually join the BRICS. So this is gigantic and is emerging. And the very fact that we are playing a protagonist role through Lula, through Brazil, which is a very good political leader, we are definitely going to make a difference. And I know that all the countries are going to support it. So Chile is a sort of it's a hiccup in this big in this big picture, but it's an important hiccup that we need to examine and analyze. Can I just one more thing, which is in terms of Chile itself, the number of people who actually spoiled their ballot in this election was 2 million. 2 million out of 12 million. The total number of people who voted was 10 million. The total number of people who spoiled their ballot, and some of the people on the radical left call openly for not voting, which is something I don't support. I don't support not voting. I think people should vote. If those 2 million votes had voted for the Unidad para Chile, maybe we would be in a very different situation. By not voting, they actually were voting for the right wing. I hope people draw that lesson. But therefore, there are forces still in Chile which can be, I don't know, mobilized and put together for something more interesting. But they need to go through a very serious process of reflection. And one of the things that they may be able to do, hopefully, is to look at, for example, how Brazil got the Workers' Party together, how many social alliances it took, who is involved, women, Black people, churches, communities of every kind, indigenous people, communities. All of that is essential to actually bring about change. And coming back to the question of Brazil, just to give you an idea, Brazil is what has a GDP of 1.6, 1.7 trillion. And Latin America as a whole, all of them, including Mexico, Argentina, and everybody else, is 5 trillion. So Brazil has, nearly more than 20% on its own. And it has industry, agriculture, technology, and anything else you want. So it's fantastic that Lula not only is the president, but also he already committed himself to be the next candidate for the next presidency, to be re-elected, which I'm sure he will be.
Yeah, it's extremely impressive. The mobilizing and the how the PT was formed. like you said, when I was reporting on the campaign, one of the things that struck me was just how diverse this base is of the PT. There are really people in this party who have very little in common with each other. Let's just say that. There's people who are, obviously from the urban center, who are urban poor. There's people from the countryside, all sorts of different people. And they got everybody on the same message, which were some very basic things. Obviously, during a campaign, you can't say exactly all the things you're going to do. Some basic things you can say. But you also have to be very aware about what the media is saying, about the things that you're going to be attacked with during the debates and during interviews with those major news anchors on primetime television and stuff like that. So they're obviously going to be very careful strategic standpoint as far as the advisors there at the PT and what they were telling Lula. But so many people were really on message. And so I do think it's an inspiration for the rest of the region as to what can be done.
Don't want to prolong this. I know there are limitations there, but he's got it right in three crucial questions. This is politics at its best. Number one, he said there are 33 during the election campaign, Lula, 33 million people in Brazil that do not eat 3 times a day. And he made the speech and cried, full of emotion, saying, how is it possible that I don't eat 3 times a day? I'm going to give my life, if necessary, to ensure that they do. That's priority number one. Priority number two, 100 million people are below the poverty line in Chile. That was the legacy of Mr. Bolsonaro. 100 million in a country of 210 million. He said, we are going to do everything possible to bring them back again, as we did before. We have done it before, we're going to do it again. And number three, he didn't say he did it. What he did was dismantle very swiftly Bolsonarismo, including Bolsonaro. When Bolsonaro was elected, I remember the discussion was, my God, fascism is going to be in Brazil for the next 20, 50, 60 years. He dismantled it in 3-4 days. The day after he was elected, Lula, the day after he was inaugurated, rather, he issued a presidential decree, signed the presidential decree. What is the word? Annulling or abrogating 6 privatizations in one single decree. In first 24 hours in charge. So that gives you an idea of where he's going. So he's got it politically right. And that's the lessons that we need to learn, all of us in the rest of Latin America. I think most of the presidents actually on the left, they know what to do. They know what exactly is the central questions. Boric didn't. And hopefully somebody else with a clear mind is going to actually take charge and move things forward in the right direction, because Chile needs to be not neoliberal and needs to join the multipolarity and needs to actually participate in the integration process that is coming with Brazil and everybody else.
Well, on that note, Francisco, I have many other questions, concerns, and comments, and other things that we hope to ask you in the future. So we'd love to have you back another time. Thank you so much for being with us. Francisco Dominguez, former head of the research group on Latin America at Middlesex University in London, UK, also a Latin American solidarity activist there in the UK, and a Chilean who is joining us for this wonderful discussion on Chile, Brazil, and much more. Thank you so much for being on with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.